certainly, sort of my mother is 80. So I grew up with this kind of sensibility of the sort of 40s and 50s that was sort of in the ether, And I remember kind of being forced to watch The Music Man, 97 times and these kind of things. And all these sort of things, and movies that at the time, that now we all love, and, we're all sort of like, oh, Betty Davis, whatever, But at the time, when you're 12, you're just like, really? Really gonna make me watch, So those things, of course, are enormously helpful, because they just sort of grew up with a sensibility about things. Or, my grandfather, who never called a refrigerator, but called it an icebox, and who did have kind of a very sort of Southern inflected dialogue, speech that my mother didn't have, for example. So I grew up a lot around people speaking in different registers with different dictions, which is a very important part of this book. And so certainly that stuff. And then also, I guess on another kind of level, I think, I grew up in very rich but sometimes somewhat difficult circumstances, and I'm an only child, so very vigilant child. And when you're a really vigilant child, you really do, your antennae are always up for something good or something bad, but you are paying, often without realizing, you're paying an enormous amount of attention to absolutely everything that's going on around you, kind of at all times. And you absorb that stuff, so you absorb speech patterns and the way people interact with each other, and look in tiny things, the look in their eye, the way they move their hand when they stir their teacup when they're angry as opposed to when they're calm, all of these kinds of things, they filter in. And I think a habit of vigilance that might form when you're a child is especially powerful because things are imprinted on you as impressions, not necessarily alongside a great deal of interpretation. And certainly some things, I'm not implying that children are not interpreting things, of course they are. But the sort of analysis that accompanies observation when you get older does not necessarily accompany it when you're a child, and so things become sort of pure impression in a way, almost visual or auditory, something sort of very sensory. So those things certainly, I think a great deal. And then of course I was an only child, so I spent an enormous amount of time in imaginary lands, sort of for days on end. I would be, I was talking to my partner the other day, I don't know how it came up. Oh, we were talking to the kid downstairs who's a neighbor who's having some trouble in school. And I said, you know what the problem with that kid is? Nobody's letting that kid use their imagination. And actually, I think that is the problem with this kid. And so we started talking about games we would play, when we were a kid. And I was remembering how, I would sort of invent something and stay in character for days and days, So I would watch, like Pride and Prejudice on PBS or something. Do you know what I mean? And my mother would be like, Ayana, do your homework. And I'd be like, I can't do my homework. I'm meeting Mr. Darcy, And she was like, all right, Jade, can you go do your math homework? So it would be, so those kinds of things, of course, are, they're, habits of imagination or an openness or maybe a little craziness, I don't know what, but sort of immersing yourself in something that is not perhaps factually true but feels very true and is a complete world,